The mop handle was smooth, worn to a soft, familiar patina by the friction of his own hands over 8 years and thousands of miles of sterile hallways. It was 2:17 a.m. at St. Jude's General Hospital, a time when the building exhaled, settling into its nocturnal rhythm of quiet suffering and mechanical sighs. Arthur Jensen, Art to the few who spoke to him, pushed the yellow bucket of graying water forward, the rubber wheels of the wringer assembly squeaking a soft, rhythmic complaint. The smell of lemon-scented disinfectant, sharp and clean, was the smell of his life now, a chemical baptism that washed away the scent of leather, old paper, and the metallic tang of ambition he once breathed like air. He moved with an economy of motion that was often mistaken for weariness. It wasn't. It was efficiency, the same principle he had once applied to dismantling a Fortune 500 company, now applied to the removal of scuff marks and grime from linoleum tiles. His body, at 55, was a study in contradictions. A slight stoop in his shoulders, cultivated to appear unassuming, fought against a naturally straight spine. His hair, once a commanding dark brown, was now a salt and pepper steel, cut short and neat. But it was his hands that were the real tell, the part of the story he couldn't erase. They were not the calloused, thickened hands of a man who had worked manual labor his entire life. The skin was smooth over the knuckles, the fingers long and elegant, the nails immaculately clean despite his work. They were the hands of a man who had once signed checks for 9 figures, who had held pens that decided the fate of thousands of employees, who had once, a lifetime ago, held the fragile hand of his wife. Tonight, the hospital felt different. A tension hummed beneath the drone of the floor polisher down the hall, a low-frequency anxiety that vibrated through the soles of his worn work boots. He saw it in the way the night shift nurses huddled at their station, their voices low and urgent, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of a monitor. He was a ghost in these halls, a part of the infrastructure, as unnoticed as a light fixture or a fire extinguisher. People spoke around him, through him, as if he were invisible. It was a state he had deliberately cultivated for 2,920 days, and it had served him well. Invisibility was a fortress. As he guided his mop in a practiced figure-8 pattern, catching the dust bunnies that gathered where the wall met the floor, he caught a scrap of conversation from the nurse's station. "Heard it's bad, Carol. Really bad. Worse than the budget crisis in 2008? That was capital expenditures. This is operational, personnel. They're bringing in some shark from Chicago. Croft, I think his name is. What are they going to do? We're already running on a skeleton crew." A third voice, younger, laced with fear. "My cousin in accounting said they're looking at pensions. Non-essential staff first." Non-essential. The word hung in the sterile air. Art paused, his mop resting in the water, the motion so slight it was imperceptible. He looked at his reflection in the freshly cleaned floor, a distorted, elongated figure in a gray uniform. Non-essential. He had spent the last 8 years being essential in the most fundamental way. He was the barrier between contagion and health. He cleaned the room where a child was born and the room where a man took his last breath. He scrubbed away the evidence of pain and panic, restoring order, making a space clean and calm for the next wave of human drama. And the word for that was non-essential. He squeezed the mop, the mechanical groan of the wringer loud in the sudden silence as the nurses dispersed. He knew the language. He recognized the pattern. Operational review. Personnel restructuring. Pension adjustments. They were the euphemisms of corporate warfare, the sterile vocabulary of financial violence. He had written that dictionary. He knew what came next. His rounds took him past the pediatric ward, and he slowed, his cart suddenly silent. Through a glass window, he could see a small girl, no older than 7, sleeping with a tangle of tubes taped to her arm. A woman, her mother, was asleep in a chair beside the bed, her head resting on her arms. A thin hospital blanket was draped over her, and Art noticed it had been tucked in just so. He recognized the handiwork of Maria, one of the cafeteria workers who often stayed late, a woman with 3 kids of her own, and a kindness that was fierce and unconditional. She had worked here for 22 years. Her pension was her future, the single point of light at the end of a long, grueling tunnel. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he'd traded his Brioni suits for a janitor's uniform. It was the precursor to a fight. He continued on his way, the squeak of his cart a lonely metronome in the vast, sleeping building. He was heading towards the administrative wing, the plushest part of the hospital, with its carpeted floors and framed art. It was the last section of his route. As he turned a corner, he saw a team of men in suits, even at this hour, gathered outside the large conference room. They were laughing, their voices too loud for the quiet hall. One of them, a man with a silver watch and an air of predatory confidence, clapped another on the back. Art recognized the type instantly. The posture, the entitlement, the utter lack of awareness of the building's true purpose around them. This, he presumed, was Croft and his team of sharks. Croft's eyes swept the hallway and passed over Art without a flicker of recognition. Art was just a function, a man with a mop. To Croft, he was already gone. Art lowered his head, his grip tightening on the mop handle, the smooth wood suddenly feeling like the shaft of a weapon. He kept pushing his cart, the rhythmic squeaking a humble, persistent protest in the face of the coming storm. He had built his fortress of invisibility to keep the world out, to protect what little he had left. But he was beginning to realize that the most dangerous threats don't always come from the outside. Sometimes they come from men in suits who walk right through your front door and tell you that your life's work is non-essential. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur Vance, the man who had buried himself inside Art Jensen, began to stir. The phone in his pocket vibrated, a silent, urgent buzz against his leg. He checked the time. 3 a.m. He ducked into the janitor's closet, a small, cluttered space that smelled of bleach and damp rags. The name on the screen glowed. Leo. His heart unclenched, the cold knot in his stomach loosening its grip. This was the only part of his old life that had mattered, the only part he had carried into this one. He answered, his voice a low whisper. "Hey, buddy. You're up late." "I had the dream again," a small voice said, thick with sleep and fear. "The one where the house is empty and I can't find you." Art leaned against a shelf of industrial-sized cleaning bottles, his eyes closing. He could picture his son, Leo, all of 10 years old, curled up in his bed, the glow of his dinosaur-shaped nightlight casting long shadows on the wall. "I'm here, Leo. I'm always here, even when you can't see me. You know that, right?" "Yeah, but I wanted to hear you." "I'm glad you called. Is Mrs. Gable there?" "She's sleeping on the couch. She makes funny noises, like a little pig." Art smiled, a genuine expression that rarely saw the light of day. "Well, don't tell her I said so, but she kind of does. Now, you try to get back to sleep. It's only a few more hours. I'll be home before you wake up, and I'll make those pancakes you like, the ones with the chocolate chips. The ones Mom used to make." The question was quiet, matter of fact, but it landed with the weight of a physical blow. Art's breath caught. 8 years. 8 years, and the ghost of his wife, Eleanor, was still in every room, in every memory, in the shape of their son's face. "Yeah, buddy," he said, his voice suddenly thick. "The ones Mom used to make. I promise, and I keep my promises. Promise. Promise." He heard Leo take a deep, settling breath on the other end of the line. "Okay, Dad. I love you." "I love you more, Leo. Go to sleep." He ended the call and stood in the darkness of the closet for a full minute, the phone clutched in his hand. I keep my promises. It was the foundational principle of his new life. He had failed to keep the most important one to Eleanor, to be there, always. He wouldn't fail his son. This quiet, simple life was for Leo. It was a shield, a penance, and a sanctuary. And Harrison Croft, with his silver watch and his talk of operational restructuring, was about to take a sledgehammer to it. If you believe that people deserve to be seen for who they truly are, not just what their job title says, subscribe now and share this story. Now, back to what happens next. The official announcement came 2 days later. An all-hands-on-deck meeting was called for 3 p.m. in the hospital cafeteria, a mandatory gathering for all non-medical staff. The air was thick with a toxic cocktail of rumor and dread. Art stood at the back of the room with Maria, whose usual warm smile was replaced by a tight, worried line. She kept twisting a napkin in her hands, shredding it into tiny white pieces. Harrison Croft strode to the makeshift podium at the front of the room. He was exactly as Art had sized him up: expensive suit, perfect teeth, and the soulless, confident charm of a man who had never had to worry about a utility bill. He began with platitudes, thanking them for their hard work and dedication, and praising the St. Jude's family. Art felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. He knew this script. First, you flatter them. Then, you gut them. "As you know," Croft said, his voice smooth and reasonable, "the healthcare landscape is more challenging than ever. To ensure St. Jude's can continue its vital mission for the next 50 years, we've had to make some difficult but necessary fiscal decisions." He clicked a button, and a slide appeared on the projection screen behind him. It was a blizzard of pie charts and bar graphs, corporate jargon designed to confuse and intimidate. Words like synergy, optimization, and right-sizing filled the screen. "After a thorough review," Croft continued, "the board has approved the St. Jude's Forward Initiative. This plan will streamline our operations and secure our financial future. A key component of this initiative involves modernizing our benefits package to bring it in line with current industry standards." He paused for effect. The room was utterly silent. "Effective the 1st of next month, the defined benefit pension plan for all non-medical personnel will be frozen. All employees with fewer than 25 years of service will be transitioned to a 401k savings plan." A gasp went through the crowd. Maria swayed beside Art, and he put a steadying hand on her arm. 22 years. She was 3 years short. "What about the money we've already paid in?" someone shouted from the crowd. Croft smiled, a practiced, patient expression. "Your accrued benefits are safe, of course, but there will be no further accruals. Instead, the hospital is pleased to offer this new, flexible 401k option, giving you more control over your financial destiny." More control. He was stealing their future and calling it a gift. There was no mention of a company match, Art noted. It was a shell game. He was taking a guaranteed income stream they had worked for decades to secure and replacing it with an empty bucket they were now responsible for filling themselves, on salaries that had barely kept up with inflation. It was theft, sanitized by a PowerPoint presentation. The questions came in a panicked flood. People who had planned their entire lives around that promise were suddenly adrift. A man from maintenance, his face pale, asked about his wife's cancer treatments. A woman from billing, tears streaming down her face, spoke of her disabled son. They were showing him their wounds, their vulnerabilities, hoping for mercy. Croft was unmoved. He fielded their desperate pleas with the detached calm of a surgeon discussing a tumor with a medical student. He used words like unfortunate, difficult, and no other way. He was a wall of polished corporate indifference. Art watched him, and the years began to peel away. The smell of the cafeteria's stale coffee and anxious sweat faded, replaced by the scent of ozone from a server farm and the faint, expensive smell of his corner office on the 54th floor of a skyscraper that pierced the Manhattan clouds. He wasn't in a hospital cafeteria. He was back in the boardroom of Vance Capital, and Harrison Croft was a junior analyst, a pretender, a man who thought he understood power because he could read a balance sheet. He didn't understand power at all. The memory was so vivid it was almost a hallucination. He could feel the cool, heavy glass of his office window under his palm as he looked down at the city spread below him like a circuit board. He had been a god in that world, a titan of a universe that measured a man's worth in basis points and leverage ratios. The name on the door was Arthur Vance, a name that made markets tremble. He was known as the Architect for his almost supernatural ability to see the hidden structures within failing companies, to find the load-bearing walls and the fatal cracks that no one else could. He didn't just buy debt, he bought control. He restructured reality to fit his will. He remembered the day he acquired the debt of a failing steel company. The CEO, a man with a family legacy stretching back a century, had sat in the very chair Croft was now metaphorically occupying, pleading for his company, for his employees, for his family's name. And Arthur Vance had looked at him with the same dispassionate gaze Croft was now giving Maria, and said, "The numbers don't care about your grandfather's portrait in the lobby. The company is over-leveraged, your pension obligations are a boat anchor, and your management is inefficient. I am not your enemy. I am a consequence." He had dismantled that company piece by piece, selling off assets, laying off thousands. He had justified it with the cold logic of the market. It was a sick organism, and he was the predator culling the herd to make it stronger. He had made a fortune for his investors, and a larger one for himself. He had been celebrated for it on the cover of magazines. He had told himself he was making the world more efficient. He had told himself it was just business. Now, standing in the back of a crowded cafeteria, smelling the fear of the people he had worked alongside for 8 years, he felt the full, crushing weight of that old hypocrisy. He saw himself in Harrison Croft, and the reflection was hideous. Croft was a pale imitation, a clumsy amateur playing with concepts Arthur Vance had mastered and, he thought, abandoned. Croft was using Art's own playbook, but he was a child who had found his father's gun. He didn't understand its true power or the devastating consequences of its misuse. Maria was openly crying now, her shoulders shaking. 22 years, she whispered to him, her voice choked with disbelief. My house is almost paid for. My youngest, he wants to go to college. What am I supposed to do, Art? What am I supposed to do? He looked from her devastated face to Croft's smug, triumphant one. The anger that rose in him was cold and pure, an Arctic tide that washed away the last 8 years of carefully constructed anonymity. It was the anger of a king who sees a fool sitting on his throne. He had built his quiet life as a penance for the sins of Arthur Vance. He had become a janitor to serve, to be humble, to atone for a lifetime of taking. But what if the ultimate act of service wasn't mopping floors? What if it was using the very skills he had tried to bury to protect the people the world deemed non-essential? The memory of his office, his power, was no longer a source of shame. It was an arsenal. Croft thought he was a shark in a pond of minnows. He had no idea he was swimming in an ocean that belonged to a leviathan. Art put a hand on Maria's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "It's going to be okay, Maria," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a new and unfamiliar weight of absolute certainty. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion and a flicker of hope. She had never heard him speak like that before. No one had. It was the voice of Arthur Vance, and it had been silent for a very long time. That night, the hospital felt like a tomb. The hollow pronouncements of the afternoon meeting echoed in the empty corridors. Every face Art passed, from the kitchen staff silently washing dishes to the orderlies grimly pushing linen carts, was etched with a quiet, desperate grief. They had been told their loyalty was worthless. He saw a man from the grounds crew, a man named Henderson, who had worked at St. Jude's for 19 years, sitting on a bench in a deserted waiting area, his head in his hands. He was a year shy of the old vesting requirement. Now he was 24 years short of the new one. He was 58 years old. Croft had not just stolen his pension, he had stolen the man's past, rendering 2 decades of backbreaking labor into a rounding error on a spreadsheet. Art finished his work with a grim, methodical focus. He cleaned Croft's new office suite, the scent of expensive leather and entitlement thick in the air. On the desk, a leather-bound folio was open. It was a list of the hospital's major bondholders. Art glanced at it. He didn't need to. He already knew every name on that list, every QSIP number, every maturity date. He knew because they were all shell corporations, legal fictions, Russian dolls, that if you opened them all would lead you to a single entity, a holding company named Eleanor's Light. The name was a secret penance, a quiet monument. When he had walked away from his old life, he couldn't bring himself to liquidate everything. It would have been like erasing her, too. Eleanor had always been his conscience, the one who saw the people behind the numbers. "They're not just assets, Arthur," she used to say, her hand on his arm. "They're lives, they're families." He hadn't listened. Not enough. So he had entrusted his empire to one man, David Chen, his brilliant and fiercely loyal protégé. The instructions were simple. Manage it, grow it, but do so quietly. And one more thing. If you ever see an opportunity to invest in something that does good, a hospital, a school, a research foundation, and the numbers make sense, do it. But never tell me. It was his way of trying to balance the scales, a silent attempt to use his wealth for good without his ego getting in the way. 6 years ago, David had called him, breaking the rule for the first and only time. "There's a portfolio of distressed hospital bonds on the market," he had said. "Mid-tier, non-profit, solid community anchor, but poorly managed. It's St. Jude's General. The yield is attractive for the risk profile. I think it fits the other mandate." Art had been standing in this very janitor's closet at the time. The irony was so thick he could barely breathe. He was mopping the floors of a hospital whose financial fate he was about to control. "Buy it, David," he had said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Buy all of it." And now, Harrison Croft, the shark from Chicago, was trying to renegotiate the terms of that debt. He was planning to offer the bondholders, he was planning to offer him, pennies on the dollar to finance the very cuts that would destroy the lives of the people Art had come to know as friends. The sheer, galling arrogance of it was breathtaking. It was a declaration of war against a man who didn't even know he was on the battlefield. He clocked out at 6 a.m., the sky outside a bruised purple. He walked home, the pre-dawn air cool on his face. He didn't drive. He lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from the hospital, a place chosen for its proximity and its anonymity. He let himself in quietly. Mrs. Gable was still asleep on the couch, snoring softly. In Leo's room, his son was a small lump under a Star Wars comforter. Art stood in the doorway, watching the gentle rise and fall of his son's chest. This was why he had done it. This peace, this simplicity. After Eleanor's death, the world of high finance, with its endless frantic urgency, had seemed like a grotesque mockery of what was truly important. He remembered the day she died with a clarity that was a physical pain. He had been in the final stages of a hostile takeover, a brutal 20-hour-a-day campaign. She had called him that morning. "Arthur, let's just go away. Just for a weekend. To the cabin. Remember the cabin?" "I can't, Elle," he'd said, his eyes on the 3 monitors in front of him, tracking market movements in Tokyo. "Not now. This deal is at a critical juncture. 2 more days. That's all I need." "It's always 2 more days, Arthur," she had said, her voice soft and sad. He heard the resignation in it, but he was too focused, too driven. "I promise," he'd said, the words tasting like ash in his memory now. "As soon as this is done, we'll go." It was the last conversation they ever had. The call from her sister came 4 hours later. A massive, sudden brain aneurysm. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. He had been staring at a stock ticker when his wife's life ended. He had all the money in the world, and he couldn't buy 1 more minute, 1 more conversation, 1 more chance to say, "Okay, let's go now." The grief had hollowed him out. His empire felt like a pile of meaningless stones. He looked at his son, then just 2 years old, and saw the only thing that mattered. So he had orchestrated his own death. Arthur Vance, the financial titan, simply vanished. He liquidated some assets, created the trusts, and walked away with enough to be comfortable, but not enough to be noticed. He became Art Jensen, a widower moving to a quiet town to raise his son. The janitor job was perfect. It was honest, physical work. It was invisible. It was penance. It gave him nights to work and days to be a father. It was everything he needed. Stories like this remind us that expertise can hide anywhere, and dismissing someone based on their position might mean missing the person who could save everything. If that resonates, hit like and comment where you're watching from. Because what Art does next changes everything. He stood there, watching his son sleep, the memory of his failure washing over him. He had built this quiet life, this fortress of humility, to protect Leo from the world that had swallowed his father and stolen his wife. But Croft's actions showed him the flaw in his design. Hiding wasn't protection. It was just abdication. He had run from the man he was, but the skills of that man, the power he had wielded, were not inherently evil. They were a tool. He had used that tool to break things. Maybe, just maybe, he could use it to fix them. He went into the kitchen and sat at the small table. He pulled out his simple, pay-as-you-go phone, a world away from the encrypted satellite phone he used to carry. He scrolled through the contacts until he found the one he hadn't used in 6 years. D. Chen. He took a deep breath, and as he pressed the call button, he felt a subtle shift inside him, a dormant part of his brain coming online. The call connected on the second ring. "Yes?" The voice was sharp, alert, professional. David Chen, a man who now ran a multi-billion-dollar fund from a discreet office in Zurich, a man who still thought of Arthur Vance as a ghost. Art cleared his throat. "David," he said. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the faint hiss of the international connection. "Arthur?" David's voice was a choked whisper, full of disbelief and something akin to reverence. "Is it really you?" "It's me, David." "My God, is everything okay? Is your son?" "He's fine. We're both fine. I need something. Information." "Anything," David said, his voice instantly snapping back to professional focus. The subordinate, the soldier, reporting for duty. "What do you need?" "St. Jude's General Hospital," Art said, his voice dropping into the old cadence, the familiar rhythm of command. "They've brought in a new CFO, Harrison Croft. He's gutting employee pensions to finance a debt restructuring. He's planning to make an offer on the 2028 senior notes. I'm looking at it now, David said. Art could hear the furious clicking of a keyboard. Croft, ex-McKinsey, then a hatchet man for a private equity firm in Chicago, known for aggressive cost-cutting. Yes, we received a preliminary feeler 2 days ago through counsel. They're planning to offer 62 cents on the dollar for the notes. A lowball offer. He thinks the bondholders are fragmented and unorganized, Art said. He thinks he can bully them into accepting a haircut so he can declare a victory to the board. He is mistaken, David said coldly. What are your instructions, Arthur? Art looked out the kitchen window at the slowly brightening sky. He saw the first rays of sun touching the rooftops. A new day. Instructions? He said softly, more to himself than to David. He thought of Maria's tears, of Henderson's slumped shoulders, of Leo's question that he knew was coming. Isn't that stealing, Dad? Arthur? Art's focus snapped back. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a clarity as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. Decline the offer, he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. Politely, but firmly. Don't give a reason, just no. And David, I need you to find out the exact language of the original bond indenture. Specifically, the covenants related to material adverse changes in operational stability. I have a feeling Mr. Croft hasn't read the fine print. I'll have it for you within the hour, David said. One more thing, Art said. Do it through the primary holding company. Eleanor's Light. I want Croft to see the name. There was a slight pause. Understood, David said, his voice tinged with a new understanding. Welcome back, Arthur. Art hung up the phone. He hadn't come back. He had never truly left. He had just been waiting for a reason to fight a war he actually believed in. He got up and started measuring out flour and chocolate chips. He had a promise to keep. The next 2 days were a study in controlled chaos, though on the surface, Art's life remained unchanged. He reported for his shift, pushed his cart, and mopped his floors. But now, he was listening. The hospital was a rumor mill running at full capacity. Croft's team had taken over the main conference room, and the hushed, anxious talk was of layoffs, department consolidations, and forced retirements. The pension news had landed like a bomb, and the aftershocks were tearing through the workforce's morale. Art moved through it all like a phantom, his expression impassive, but his mind was a whirlwind of activity. David had sent him the bond indenture, a document as thick as a phone book. Art had read it on his phone during his breaks, his eyes scanning the dense legalese with a speed and comprehension that had not dulled with time. And he had found it. A small, overlooked covenant, Section 9.4a. It stipulated that any action by the hospital's management that could be reasonably foreseen to cause significant degradation of workforce stability or morale could be considered a technical default, giving the bondholders the right to accelerate the debt, to demand full and immediate repayment. It was a poison pill inserted into the agreement by a cautious underwriter 20 years ago and forgotten by everyone. Everyone except the man who now owned the debt. On the third day, he was cleaning the windows in the main lobby when he saw Maria. She was sitting on a bench, not crying, but staring into space with a terrifyingly empty expression. She was holding a letter from the hospital's HR department, a crisp white sheet of paper that detailed her new, worthless retirement plan. He walked over and sat beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I went to the bank, she said, her voice flat. I showed them this, asked them about a loan for my son's college. They laughed, Art, not out loud, but, you know, that polite little laugh that says you're not worth their time. She folded the letter with shaking hands. 30 years I was planning. I did everything right. I worked overtime. I never called in sick. And for what? So a man in a fancy suit can get a bigger bonus? Art looked at her, at the deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the quiet dignity that was being eroded by sheer despair. This was the human cost of a number on a spreadsheet. This was what he used to ignore. "This isn't over, Maria," he said. She gave him a sad, tired smile. "It's sweet of you to say that, Art, but it is. We're just the little people. We don't have a voice." "Everyone has a voice," Art said, his own voice steady and low. "Sometimes you just need to find the right room to use it in." He stood up and walked away, leaving her staring after him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. He went straight to the administrative wing. He walked up to the polished mahogany desk where Harrison Croft's executive assistant, a young woman with a perpetually strained expression, presided over a bank of phones. "I need to see Mr. Croft," Art said. She looked up, her eyes taking in his gray uniform, the name Art stitched over his pocket, and the faintest smell of bleach that clung to him. Her expression was a perfect blend of pity and dismissal. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Art said. "Mr. Croft has a very full schedule. He's in back-to-back meetings all day. If you have a concern, you can submit it through the proper channels at HR." She had already turned her attention back to her computer screen. He was dismissed. Art didn't move. He simply stood there, patient, silent. A minute passed. The assistant, sensing his continued presence, looked up again, her annoyance now visible. "Sir, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. You'll have to leave." "I'll wait," Art said calmly. He moved to the side of the reception area, near a rather uninspired abstract painting, and stood there, perfectly still. He didn't lean against the wall. He didn't fidget. He just stood, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his posture suddenly losing its deferential stoop. He was a quiet, immovable object. Another 10 minutes passed. People came and went, men and women in suits who barely glanced at him. The assistant was becoming visibly flustered, making pointedly loud phone calls. Art remained. He had once waited 17 hours in a hotel lobby in Tokyo for a 5-minute meeting that netted him control of a semiconductor company. He was a patient man. Finally, the door to Croft's office opened, and Croft himself emerged, laughing with another executive. He saw Art standing there, and his smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He said something to the other man, and then strode over to Art, his assistant scurrying behind him. "Can I help you?" Croft asked, his tone making it clear he had no intention of helping. "My name is Art Jensen. I work in custodial services," Art said, his voice even. "I need 5 minutes of your time." Croft glanced at his watch, a gold Patek Philippe that was worth more than Art's annual salary. "I'm afraid that's not possible. My schedule is—" "It's about the 2028 senior notes," Art said. Croft froze. The dismissive posture, the air of impatience, it all vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp stillness. He stared at Art, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the janitor's uniform, then back at Art's face, searching for some sign, some clue that would make sense of the words he had just heard. "What did you just say?" Croft asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I said, I'd like to talk about your restructuring plan for the hospital's bond debt," Art repeated, not a trace of fear in his voice. "I believe you'll want to hear what I have to say." Croft stared at him for a long moment, his mind clearly racing. He was a shark that had just seen a fish behave in a way no fish should. Curiosity, and perhaps a primal sense of danger, won out over his arrogance. "In my office," he snapped, turning on his heel. "You have 2 minutes." Art followed him into the office. It was large and opulent, with a vast mahogany desk and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the hospital's manicured grounds. the seat of power. Croft didn't offer him a chair. He stood behind his desk, a king on his throne, arms crossed, radiating impatience. "All right, start talking," Croft said. "This had better be good." Art took in the room, the expensive art, the self-congratulatory awards on the shelf. He had a dozen offices just like this one, sitting empty all over the world. "You made an offer of 62 cents on the dollar to the holders of the St. Jude's 2028 senior secured notes," Art began, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "It was a bold move, an attempt to force a significant haircut by leveraging the perceived fragmentation of the creditors." Croft's face was a mask of stone, but Art could see a flicker of shock in his eyes. "How could you possibly know the details of that offer? It was made through private counsel." "The offer was rejected this morning," Art continued, ignoring the question. "Bluntly, and without a counter, this puts you in a difficult position. Your entire St. Jude's Forward initiative is predicated on the savings from that debt restructuring. Without it, you can't fund the transition to the 401(k) plans, and your budget is several $1,000,000 in the red. The board will not be pleased." Croft's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of his desk. "Who are you?" he demanded, the words a low growl. "Did one of the unions put you up to this? Are you recording this?" "I'm a janitor," Art said simply. "I've worked here for 8 years. I have 22 years left on my mortgage. I was counting on my pension. Your plan takes that away from me, and from hundreds of others. People like Maria Suarez in the cafeteria, who has worked here for 22 years. People like Frank Henderson in groundskeeping, who has been here for 19. Croft let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Oh, I see. You got your hands on some information you shouldn't have, and you think you can come in here and play hardball for your union buddies? You have no idea what you're messing with. I'm negotiating with a consortium of hedge funds and investment banks. They eat little guys like you for breakfast." Art allowed a small, thin smile to touch his lips. It was a smile Croft would see in his nightmares. "That's where you're mistaken, Mr. Croft. You're not negotiating with a consortium. The bond issue wasn't bought up by a dozen different funds. It was acquired, in its entirety, 6 years ago, by a single private holding company." Croft's sneer faltered. He was a card player who had just been told the deck was stacked. A single entity? Who? Art took a step closer to the desk, his presence seeming to fill the room, the gray janitor's uniform suddenly looking like a suit of armor. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost gentle tone. "You've been trying to bully a ghost, Mr. Croft. You made your lowball offer to a holding company called Eleanor's Light." Croft's face went pale. Art could see the name registering, could see him connecting it to the rejection notice that must be sitting on his desk. "How do you know that name?" Croft whispered, the last of his bravado gone. Art stood up straight, the quiet dignity of the janitor replaced by the absolute, unshakable authority of the Titan. He looked Croft directly in the eye, and for the first time, he let the man see exactly who he was. "I know the name," Art said, his voice as quiet and as final as a closing door, "because I named it. I know they rejected your offer because I told them to. You seem to be under the impression that you're dealing with a scattered group of investors you can intimidate. You're not. You're dealing with one person." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle in the silent room. "You're dealing with me." If this story is proving that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about acting anyway, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Because Art didn't stay invisible. He chose to be seen, and that choice is about to matter more than anyone expected. The silence in the office was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the air, the sound, the arrogance right out of Harrison Croft. His face, usually a mask of confident command, had crumbled. It was a ruin of confusion, disbelief, and dawning, gut-wrenching terror. He stared at the man in the janitor's uniform, his mind furiously trying to reconcile the image with the impossible words he had just heard. "You?" Croft finally managed, the word a strangled croak. You mop the floors." It wasn't a statement of condescension anymore. It was a desperate plea for reality to reassert itself. "I do," Art said calmly. "And I take pride in my work. It's honest, it's tangible. But it's what I do, Mr. Croft, not who I am. You, of all people, should understand the difference between a man's position and his assets." He used the cold, clinical language of Croft's own world, and it was like a slap in the face. Croft sank into his high-backed leather chair, the movement stiff and uncoordinated. He ran a hand over his face, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume. "This is insane. It's not possible. The Eleanor's Light Fund. It's a multi-billion-dollar holding company based in Zurich. Its portfolio is managed by—" He trailed off, his eyes widening as a new, more terrifying thought occurred to him. He was looking not at a janitor, but at a ghost, a legend. He fumbled with his keyboard, his hands shaking, and typed a name into a search engine. The results filled the screen. Old articles from the Wall Street Journal, black and white photos of a younger, darker-haired man. The headline of a 10-year-old Forbes article read, "The Vanishing Titan, What Happened to Arthur Vance?" Croft looked from the picture on the screen to the man standing before him. The face was older, grayer, etched with lines of grief and weariness, but the eyes were the same, cold, intelligent, and utterly in command. "Vance," Croft breathed, the name like a prayer and a curse. "Arthur Vance, the architect." "I haven't used that name in a long time," Art said, his voice softening slightly. "I am Art Jensen, and Art Jensen is very concerned about his pension." The absurdity and the gravity of that statement hit Croft at the same time. The man who had once restructured the debt of entire nations was standing in his office talking about a janitor's pension. It was a checkmate so elegant, so complete, that it was almost beautiful. Croft felt a wave of professional humiliation so profound it was nauseating. He had been playing checkers against a grandmaster of chess. He had been so focused on the board, he hadn't even bothered to look at his opponent. "What do you want?" Croft asked, his voice now small, defeated. The fight was gone. He was no longer a shark. He was bait. "I want you to reinstate the pension plan," Art said. "Not just for me, for everyone. The 25-year vesting rule is gone. Everyone with 10 years or more of service is fully vested. Everyone with less has their accruals protected and will be vested after 10 years of total service. The hospital will continue its contributions at the pre-existing rate." Croft shook his head, a gesture of automatic, systemic refusal. "I can't. The board will never approve it. We don't have the money. That's the whole reason for the restructuring." "Then you'll have to find it," Art said. "Or rather, we will." He walked around the desk and looked at the figures on Croft's monitor. "Your projections are lazy. You've budgeted for a 12% increase in pharmaceutical costs, but you haven't negotiated a new contract with your primary supplier in 3 years. You're paying a 4% premium on medical equipment by using 3 different vendors instead of consolidating and demanding a bulk discount. Your energy costs are astronomical because no one has bothered to do a comprehensive efficiency audit of this 50-year-old building. You're bleeding millions in operational inefficiencies, and you want to fix it by stealing from the people who make the least. It's not just cruel, Mr. Croft. It's incompetent." Each sentence was a precisely aimed blow. Arthur Vance was dissecting his business model with the casual expertise of a master butcher, and Croft could do nothing but sit there and bleed. And then, Art continued, his voice hardening again, there's the matter of the debt. Since you seem to have forgotten to read your own bond indentures, allow me to remind you of Section 9.4a, the covenant regarding material adverse changes to workforce stability. I believe gutting the pensions of your entire non-medical staff qualifies, which means, as the sole bondholder, I have the right to accelerate the debt. All of it. I can demand you repay the full $78 million. Not in 2028. Now. Today. Croft's face went ashen. He knew what that meant. It would trigger every cross-default clause in every other loan the hospital had. It would force them into immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. The hospital would close. You wouldn't, Croft whispered. You work here. You'd be destroying your own hospital. Don't mistake my presence for sentimentality, Art said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. I came to this hospital because it was a place of healing. You are turning it into a place of business, and a poorly run one at that. I would rather see it burned to the ground and have its assets sold to someone who understands that a hospital's most valuable asset isn't its MRI machine, but its people, than let you turn it into another soulless corporation that preys on the vulnerable. Your choice, Mr. Croft. Art turned and walked toward the door. Wait, Croft called out, his voice cracking. Vance, Mr. Jensen, what do I tell the board? Art paused at the door, his hand on the knob. He looked back, his expression unreadable. You will tell them that the bondholders have rejected your offer. You will tell them that a full pension reinstatement is a non-negotiable condition of any future conversations, and you will schedule a new town hall for tomorrow afternoon. And what happens at this town hall? Croft asked, dreading the answer. You will get up in front of the same people you dismissed, and you will tell them that the board has reconsidered, Art said. You will announce the full and immediate reinstatement of the pension plan, under the terms I have just outlined. You will apologize for the distress this misunderstanding has caused, and you will do it with humility, or I will exercise my rights under Section 9.4a, and you will be the CFO who presided over the complete collapse of a 100-year-old institution. Am I clear? Croft could only nod, a marionette whose strings had just been cut. Art opened the door and walked out, closing it softly behind him. He stepped back into the hallway, into the world where he was just Art the janitor. The executive assistant stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. He gave her a polite, almost imperceptible nod and walked away, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. The king had left the throne room, content to go back to sweeping the castle floors, having reminded the usurper just who the castle belonged to. The next 24 hours were a strange dream. Art went back to his duties, the familiar weight of the mop handle a comforting anchor in the surreal storm he had unleashed. Whispers followed him now, but they were different. Confused. He saw Croft emerge from his office an hour later, his face pale and drawn, barking orders into his phone. The administrative wing was a hive of panicked activity. Art just kept cleaning, a calm island in a sea of turmoil. He got a call from Leo that evening. Dad, did something happen at work? You sound different. Art smiled. Different how, buddy? I don't know. Bigger. Your voice sounds bigger. Just a busy day, Art said. How was school? They talked about homework and a video game and what they should have for dinner. The simple, beautiful normalcy of it was what he was fighting for. Before they hung up, Leo said, That man, the one who was taking the money from your friends, did you fix it? I'm working on it, Leo, Art said. I keep my promises. The town hall the next day was held in the same cafeteria, but the atmosphere was completely different. The dread was gone, replaced by a crackling, anxious curiosity. The room was even more packed than before. Art stood in the back again, Maria beside him. She looked at him with a question in her eyes that he didn't answer. He just gave her a small, reassuring nod. Harrison Croft walked to the podium. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a stiff, almost fragile formality. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the silent room. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice strained. "I've called you here today to provide an update on the St. Jude's Forward initiative." He took a deep, shaky breath. After further review and in consultation with the hospital's primary financial stakeholders, the board has decided to alter its course regarding the employee pension plan. A murmur went through the crowd. "Effective immediately," Croft said, the words sounding like they were being pulled from him under duress. "The defined benefit pension plan will be fully reinstated. Furthermore, the board has approved a modification to the vesting requirements. All employees with 10 or more years of service are now considered fully vested." A wave of astonished gasps and shouts swept through the cafeteria. People were turning to each other, their faces alight with disbelief and dawning joy. Maria grabbed Art's arm, her knuckles white. "Art, how?" Croft held up a hand for silence, though it took a full minute for the noise to subside. I apologize," he said, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "I apologize for the anxiety and uncertainty that the initial announcement caused. It was a mistake. The board and I are deeply committed to the well-being of our entire St. Jude's family. Your dedication is this hospital's greatest asset." He was using the right words, but Art could hear the echo of his own voice in them. It was a surrender, a complete and unconditional surrender. As Croft finished his brief, humiliating speech and practically fled from the podium, the cafeteria erupted. People were cheering, hugging, crying with relief. Maria threw her arms around Art, sobbing into his shoulder. "I don't know how, but you did this," she said, her voice muffled by his uniform. "You did this." Art just patted her back, his eyes scanning the jubilant crowd. He saw Henderson, the groundskeeper, standing with his wife, both of them weeping with relief. He saw faces that had been gray with worry, now bright with hope. This feeling, this tangible, profound joy that he had created, was a currency more valuable than any he had ever traded. It was the feeling he had been searching for in the bottom of a bottle of disinfectant for 8 years. His work was not done. He knew Croft, or the board, would try something else. This was just the first battle. Later that night, as he was making his rounds, his phone buzzed. It was David. "Arthur," he said, his voice crisp. "As you predicted, they're trying to find a way around you. Croft just convened an emergency board meeting. They're exploring options to secure alternative financing to buy out your bonds, even at a premium." "They're trying to remove the gun from their head," Art said. "It's a logical move." "So, what's our countermove?" David asked, the excitement clear in his voice. He was enjoying the game. "It's not a game, David," Art said quietly. "This is about people's lives." He paused, thinking. "It's time to put the gun back in the holster, but chain it to the wall. Draft a new covenant proposal. We'll offer to refinance the hospital's debt at a significantly lower interest rate, let's say 200 basis points below market. It will save them millions a year." David was silent for a moment. "That's generous, Arthur. You'd be leaving a significant amount of money on the table." "The hospital needs to be financially healthy to survive," Art said, "but the offer is conditional. The new covenant will explicitly tie the debt terms to the pension fund. Any reduction in pension contributions or adverse change to the plan, without the express written consent of the bondholder, will constitute an immediate default. Link the two permanently." If they touch the pensions, the whole house of cards comes down. Make it ironclad. Checkmate, David breathed. You're not just winning the battle, you're changing the rules of the war. They'll have no choice but to accept. I know, Art said. Send the proposal to Croft's personal email in 1 hour. Subject line, a better way forward. He hung up. He was no longer just protecting the employees. He was saving the hospital from itself. He was using his power not just to block, but to build. He was being the architect again, but this time he was building a sanctuary, not a slaughterhouse. The next morning, a formal request came for Art Jensen to meet with the entire hospital board. Not in Croft's office, but in the main boardroom. He was finishing his shift, and he went as he was, in his gray uniform, the faint smell of bleach his calling card. He walked into the room. 12 men and women in expensive suits sat around a massive oak table. Harrison Croft was at the far end, looking small and defeated. The chairman of the board, a formidable-looking man named Marcus Thorne, stood up. "Mr. Jensen," Thorne said, his voice cautious but respectful. "Or should we be calling you Mr. Vance?" "Art is fine," Art said, his gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of every person at the table. "Art, then," Thorne said. "We have received your proposal. It is, to be frank, the most unusual one this board has ever seen." He slid a piece of paper across the table. "We accept your terms, but we have a counter-proposal of our own. It's not about the debt." He paused. "We want you to join this board. We need you. It's become painfully clear that we have been focused on the wrong metrics. We've been trying to save the hospital by cutting its heart out. You see things differently. We need that vision, not as an outside threat, but as an inside partner." Art looked at the faces around the table. He saw fear, respect, and a dawning, desperate hope. They were offering him a way back, a seat at the table he had abandoned. The power, the prestige, the world of Arthur Vance. And his first immediate instinct was to say no. He had run from that world for a reason. It was a world that had cost him his wife, his peace, his soul. "Thank you for the offer," he said, his voice even. "But I'm not interested in being on your board. I'm a janitor." "With all due respect," Thorne pressed, "you are the man who owns this hospital's debt and just outmaneuvered our entire finance committee with a forgotten clause in a 20-year-old document. You are much more than a janitor. We need your expertise." "My expertise comes at a price," Art said, thinking of Eleanor, of the empty space beside him in his bed. "A price I am no longer willing to pay." He was about to turn and leave when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Leo, a picture of a drawing he had made at school. It was a superhero. The superhero was wearing a gray uniform and holding a mop in one hand and a giant bag of money in the other. Below it, Leo had written, "Super Dad." Art stared at the picture. He thought of Leo's voice on the phone. "Your voice sounds bigger." He had spent 8 years making himself smaller for his son, trying to become a simple, safe, quiet man. But what if Leo didn't need him to be small? What if he needed him to be whole? What if hiding his strength wasn't protecting his son, but teaching him that the best parts of yourself should be buried? He looked up at the board, a new thought taking shape in his mind. Not a return, but an integration. "I will not join your board," he said, his voice firm. "I will not become Arthur Vance again, but I will accept a different role." Thorne leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "What role?" "Create a new position," Art said, the idea coming to him fully formed. "An independent ombudsman, the community and fiscal advocate. I will report directly to the board, but I will not be a member of it. My mandate will be to represent the interests of the hospital's two most important communities, its patients and its employees. I will have full access to all financial records and veto power over any operational change that adversely affects patient care or employee welfare. My salary will be the same as the head of custodial services, and I will continue to work my shifts. There was a stunned silence. Croft looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "You want to keep being a janitor?" Thorne asked, utterly bewildered. "I need to walk the floors," Art said. "I need to talk to the nurses, the orderlies, the kitchen staff. I need to see the broken equipment and the overflowing linen closets for myself. The truth of this hospital isn't in your spreadsheets. It's in the hallways. I can't do the job from this boardroom. My office will be the janitor's closet on the 3rd floor. Those are my terms." Thorne looked around the table at the other board members. They were speechless. It was a power play so unorthodox, so profound, it completely rewrote the rules. Art wasn't just demanding a seat at the table. He was redesigning the whole concept of the table. Finally, Thorne extended a hand. "Mr. Jensen, Art, you have a deal." Art shook his hand. It was a firm, dry grip, the grip of a man who knew he had just saved his hospital. A year passed. The transformation of St. Jude's was quiet but profound. The Jensen Protocol, as it came to be known, was implemented, linking the fiscal health of the pension fund directly to executive compensation. Suddenly, the C-suite was passionately interested in the long-term well-being of its employees. Art Jensen became a living legend within the hospital walls. He still wore his gray uniform, but now, as he pushed his cart, people would stop him. A nurse would point out a recurring software glitch that was delaying patient labs. A surgeon would complain about the outdated surgical scopes in OR3. An orderly would mention that the wheels on the gurneys in the ER were sticking. Art would listen, nod, and make a note on a small pad he kept in his pocket. And then, things would change. He attended board meetings once a month, still in his work clothes. He would sit silently, listening, and then, in his quiet, calm voice, he would speak. He spoke of operational drag and supply chain logistics, but he illustrated his points with stories about Maria's struggle to get fresh produce for the cafeteria, or the extra 10 minutes it took a nurse to reboot a faulty workstation. He connected the numbers on the page to the lives in the hallways. He was the architect, but he was building with compassion. Harrison Croft remained the CFO. Humbled and terrified of Art, he had become ruthlessly efficient at implementing Art's suggestions. He had discovered a new kind of success, the success of a hospital that was both fiscally sound and humanely run. He and Art developed a strange, formal, but effective working relationship. One evening, Art was walking toward the exit, his shift over, when a young woman approached him, her parents beside her. Art recognized her. She was the patient whose life had been saved by the surgeon who now had new, state-of-the-art equipment, purchased after Art had renegotiated the vendor contracts. "Mr. Jensen?" she asked, her voice shy. I wanted to thank you. My doctor told me, he told me you're the reason this hospital is still a place that cares." Art just smiled. "I'm just the janitor," he said. "I'm glad you're feeling better." He went home. The apartment was filled with the smell of baking pizza. Leo, now 11 and an inch taller, was at the table doing his homework. He looked up and grinned. "Hey, Dad, did you save the world again today?" he asked, his tone light and teasing. "Just cleaned a few floors," Art said, ruffling his son's hair, "but I did it really well." He looked around the small, warm apartment. A photo of Eleanor sat on the mantelpiece, her smile bright and loving. For years, he had looked at that photo with a heart full of guilt and loss. Now, he looked at it with a sense of peace. He was finally living a life she would have been proud of. He was using his gifts not for greed, but for good. He was honoring her memory not by hiding from the world, but by healing a small part of it. Later that night, as he tucked Leo into bed, his son looked up at him. "You know, Dad," he said sleepily, "I'm glad you stopped being invisible. It's nice to be able to see you." The words hit Art with the force of a revelation. He kissed his son's forehead and went to the living room window, looking out at the city lights. He had spent so long building walls to protect his son, never realizing that the greatest gift he could give him was a father who was fully himself. If this story reminded you that hiding isn't the same as healing, and that being truly seen is worth the risk, subscribe, share, and comment below. Because somewhere right now, someone is hiding gifts the world needs. Maybe this story will remind them to step forward. He wasn't Arthur Vance, the ruthless titan. He wasn't Art Jensen, the invisible janitor. He was a father, a protector, an advocate, an architect of a better way. He was a man who mopped floors and restructured debt. He was, finally, completely and unapologetically whole. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his work was just beginning.